Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247, and this is for our class for Friday, December 5th, where we are talking about incidents in the life of a slave girl. I also wanted to direct your attention to the notes below. The first section, you'll see that paper number 1 has been graded and returned. So if you have not received paper number 1, please contact me. Now, that does not include revisions, so I have not done revisions yet. They're in the queue, so to speak. Paper number 2 is due on the last day of class. That happens to be the 18th, which is when we are having our final examination. Our final is an essay exam. It's open book, open notes, where basically I'll give you a series of essay questions from which to choose, and you get to decide and then ultimately respond. And I understand that whatever you write won't be as neat or as polished or as developed as anything that you might do in a paper, nor are you expected to. And if this were a face-to-face class, you'd have approximately 2 to 3 hours to finish that exam, which is as much time as I anticipate you should be spending on the exam. But what I will do is give you 24 hours to complete that exam. Basically, I will post the exam on our last day of class, the 18th, and you have 24 hours in which to respond to that. So it would be due on the 19th. So I'll post it on the 18th by 6 p.m., which is when our class would normally meet if we were having a face-to-face class. And it'll be due the Friday at 6 p.m. And in terms of revisions, that would be the very last day in which you could hand in any revisions. Keep in mind that if you are doing a revision of the first paper, you have to submit in the original with my evaluation, my graded content, comments, along with your revised copy. And incidents in the life of a slave girl, it's hard to believe that such an event could have occurred. So you'll see that below my video, I've got 3 videos for you to watch that talk a little bit about Harriet Jacobs' history and the scholarship that went into verifying the events. They're each between 5 to 8 minutes long or so. And when you put them all together, you'll have a good review of who Harriet Jacobs was and some of the scholarship that went into verifying the events that occurred to her. And as we know, we've got a female slave narrative that talks about the hardships associated with slavery, especially for females, and calls for reform, as well as a kind of 19th century sentimental novel that focuses on things like decorum and virginity and virtue under siege. So, as you know, that would have been a very common writing style during the time period. And one of the things that I think makes this text interesting is how one defines resistance. Can one resist in a passive way? We definitely see that Harriet Jacobs was able to do such a thing by remaining true to herself and maintaining her self-respect. And as I believe I might have mentioned in a previous class, the female bonding that we see between Harriet Jacobs and her grandmother is something that is unique, at least in terms of the text that we've read this semester. And this text perhaps illustrates better than any other text the power of reading and writing. It's only because Harriet Jacobs was taught to read and write, which of course was seen as a threat to slave owners. This allowed Harriet Jacobs to document her story and to give a story that calls for reform. So definitely girls could be ruined by a book, not just in terms of Harriet Jacobs' life and writing this text, but certainly any readers of this particular text who might question the system of slavery and begin to see parallels with other forms of oppression, such as sexism. Not that they are in any way equated, but certainly there are commonalities. And we get a sweet and a bitter tale here. There are good things that happen to Harriet Jacobs in a system that's filled with degradation and ugliness, and we do see the ugly underbelly of slavery. And what it's like to be a woman in a male society, what it's like to be a slave in a free society, because we spend some of the time talking about her experiences in the North, which provide a certain level of freedom, but not true freedom, and what it's like to be Black in a white society. Again, when you think about texts like Persuasion, which are occurring at the same time, it's hard to believe that this is also occurring at the same time. So she was born a slave in North Carolina. She didn't realize she was a slave until her quote kind unquote mistress. In other words, she wasn't physically or emotionally abused. Um, but of course, just the entire institution of slavery is unkind. Um, Basically, her mistress died and bequeathed her to a 5-year-old niece, Emily Flint. And the names have been changed in order to, in some ways, protect identities, and in other ways, I think, just to protect the psyche of the author. Can you imagine how difficult it would be writing all of this? And even though Harriet Jacobs is not necessarily a literary author in the sense of the canon, those works that are considered by scholars and critics worth literary study, she still uses very clever devices. It's no mistake that the name that she chooses for her new slaveholders, their surname is Flint. They're hard. They're like steel. Um, and basically, Linda is turning into a woman, which puts particular challenges to a slave. A Flint being hard, jagged, steely, and of course, we know that Dr. Flint is spending most of his time sexually pursuing her, which is the lot of female slaves. And of course, the contradiction that a slave is not considered to be of value, and yet slave owners would pursue slaves sexually. So obviously they had some value, but they were treated in effect as possessions, property. Even the kind mistress saw Harriet as an opportunity to give a gift to her young niece. Obviously, 6-year-old can't care for slaves, so assuming that slaves can be cared for. So that meant that ultimately the Flint family, especially Dr. Flint, would have ultimate control over Harriet. And we read several incidents, hence the name Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. The Dilemma of a Slave Child, one of Harriet's brothers, William. Who do you follow? Do you follow your father or do you follow your slave master when both of them have conflicting demands? Of course, we know that part of the institution of slavery was to try to destroy the familial system, so to remove any kind of power associated with child rearing of the father. And we still see the effects of that in contemporary times. And William, I think, says something quite tellingly in the 4th chapter, that he didn't mind the smart of a whip, but he didn't like the idea of being whipped. It's the principle of the thing. And of course, one of the ways that Harriet Jacobs finds to be able to embrace a certain level of autonomy is by choosing who she sleeps with and gives her virginity to, so to speak. And she finds a man of power and a man of a certain amount of privilege and wealth, Mr. Sands. Again, think about how a sand is not firm, it's sandatory, shifty, which explains his character very well. Mr. Sands being a prominent politician, obviously white, who is continually offering the possibility of freedom for Harriet and her children, but just somehow never gets around to it. I hope you hear the sarcasm in my voice. Of course, one of the more astonishing pieces of the tale is that Harriet, in pursuit, realizes that she needs to go to hiding, and she hides in plain sight in her grandmother's garret. It's basically a coffin like structure that's 9 feet long, 7 feet wide, and she spends 7 years there. Incredible. Which gets to the question of what exactly is freedom and what is slavery. And obviously, Harriet is not experiencing freedom. And yet, because she's not underneath the thumb of Sands, she's more free in that coffin like structure than she ever would have been when she was a slave for the household. And in chapter 15, one of the things that Flint says to Harriet Jacobs, and she chooses the name Linda, which means pretty in Spanish. Again, I think that's quite deliberate. Linda, you desire freedom for yourself and your children. You can only obtain it through me. And what we see is that Harriet Jacobs, through the character Linda Brent, shows the exact opposite. At age 40, ultimately, Harriet Jacobs or Linda Brent is purchased by Mrs. Bruce and given her freedom. Again, she talks about what a bitter pill that is, that certainly she appreciates her freedom, but the idea of thinking of herself as property. Remember William saying that he didn't mind being the or experiencing the smart of a whip, but what he did mind ultimately was the idea of being whipped. So what we see is something comparable when Harriet Jacobs says the idea that she needs to be purchased, to be given her freedom, something that is a right of all living beings. So we see the physical and the mental abuse. We see the brutality, the cruelty, the hardship, degradation, persecution, and hypocrisy, which is the attendance question for today. There is so much hypocrisy that is in this novel. I suggested that you identify one piece of hypocrisy that you think is particularly relevant. This is the weekend, by the way, that I catch up on the discussion forum responses so that ultimately, you'll get my responses for the discussion forum for responses you've made. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. Certainly, if you're moved to, you can respond. What you'll have is a good overview of a discussion of the text, which would be very helpful for the final examination. And you don't know what the question is for the final. Basically, the best way to prepare for the final is to have done all of the readings and watched all of the videos. It is open book, open notes, so that you can access things like our Moodle site. And if you have been listening to all of the videos and you have been reading all of the text, it's just a question of synthesizing everything together for the final examination. We know that part of the purpose of the writing of this piece is not necessarily for a cathartic exploration of the experiences that Linda Brent or Harry Jacobs experienced, that mostly urge reform. And she urges specifically white women who only feel jealousy and rage to rise up because, again, of some of the common parallels. And you might have learned some things about slavery. I know I'm always astonished that I never learned about Harriet Jacobs' story in a history class, and you yourself might have a similar experience. But on New Year's Day, you may or may not know that basically that's when auctions occurred. So New Year's Day was a day of particular sadness for the Black community. That they were unable to choose their mate was chosen for them. That free Black men were given the quote privilege, unquote, of earning their own wages, which oftentimes would be borrowed, quote unquote, by their slave masters and never returned. That one could actually attempt to buy one's family's freedom, or as much freedom as could be bought in this system. That oftentimes it was preferable to die and to even hope for death than to live with the brutality of slaverism or slavery. And a muster, which is an opportunity, and this is a quote, an opportunity for the low whites who had no, quote, Negroes, unquote, to scourge, to show their subserviency to the slaveholders, not reflecting that the power which trampled on the colored people also kept themselves in poverty, ignorance, and moral degradation. So yet this is another disenfranchised group that, and this in terms of income rather than in terms of ethnicity or gender, if all of them were to work together, they could obviously overthrow the system. And that the slave follows the lot of the mother, not the father, which is one of the reasons why so many white slaveholders were basically creating children with their slaves, but didn't think of them as children, just thought of them as extensions of property for which they had no responsibility. And that a slave could actually act as a wet nurse for white children. And again, another piece of hypocrisy in that a slave would be suitable for breastfeeding one's child, but certainly not suitable to be given freedom or to be considered human. The fugitive slave law, which allowed slaves to be captured and brought back to the South, which illustrated some of the Northern racism. And Harriet Jacobs or Linda Brent talks about the subtlety of the Northern racism as compared to the very explicit Southern racism. But racism is racism. And one of the things that she finds, because she does travel abroad, is in chapter 35, finding I was resolved to stand up for my rights as she continues to demand equal treatment. They concluded to treat me well, but there's some poor creatures who've been so brutalized that they'll sneak out of the way to give their masters free access to their wives and daughters, which perhaps might answer the question of why not try to overthrow the system, or why didn't more people try to overthrow the system that they were trapped in. And again, even though Harriet Jacobs is not a writer by training, she still has some interesting turns of phrases. One of my favorites is in chapter 9, where she says she was in 21 years in that cage of obscene birds. And I love that image, the cage of obscene birds. And in fact, that transitions us over to our next text, which will be our last text, which will be next week, The Awakening. So we end the way we began with Kate Chopin. But we began with a short story of Kate Chopin's, The Story of an Hour, and we end with Kate Chopin's novella, The Awakening, which was considered to be so scandalous that it basically ended Kate Chopin's career. A novella, as I've mentioned before, is longer than a short story, but not quite as long as a novel. So this read should go faster, but that's not to say that it doesn't have depth or complexity. In many ways, it reads like a short story just because of the symbolism and the construction, the careful construction of language. And we know that in Story of an Hour, Kate Chopin was fond of talking about birds. We will see the same in The Awakening as well. And you can see in the notes below in the fourth section, I have the link to The Awakening in the case that you don't have a paper copy of the text. So again, for today's discussion forum question, which will be due Saturday the 6th, again, if you need additional time, please let me know. I'll be happy to grant it to you. What do you think is one of the most hypocritical acts in incidents? And there are so many. And explain why. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.